The Better Angels of Our Nature, written by Canadian-American psychologist Steven Pinker, was published 10 years ago today. The book's central argument that violence has trended downward across human history has drawn both praise and criticism ever since. Pinker followed Better Angels up with Enlightenment Now in 2018, which expanded his optimistic argument to cover other areas of human life such as health and democracy. It was also divisively received. Better Angels is one of my favourite books, so I thought I'd take the opportunity today to discuss what relevance it could hold in our current day and age. We live in a world still yet to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic, with violent crime rising in the United States and democracy in retreat globally. And yet, I think this optimistic book is still relevant. So firstly, what does Pinker argue in Better Angels? Well, he argues that the decline of violence has occurred in 6 phases. Firstly, there's the pacification process, where the rise of states and governments which could enforce the law brought down the high rate of murder in stateless hunter-gatherer societies. This is possibly the most controversial of Pinker's 6 phases, as some argue that the murder rate in hunter-gatherer societies was very low. Unfortunately, we don't have time for that debate in this video. Secondly, came the civilizing process, where new social standards of conduct helped to bring down the murder rate between the medieval age and the 20th century. Then comes the Humanitarian Revolution, when Enlightenment ideas take hold and liberal democratic governments come to replace autocratic regimes, and human rights come to be widely valued. Fourthly, there is the Long Peace, referring to the virtual end of war between developed countries, especially democracies, after World War II. Fifthly, there's the New Peace, referring to the decline of civil wars, autocracy and terrorism after the Cold War. Pinker acknowledged that this was somewhat tenuous and it hasn't really borne out in the years since the book was published. Finally, there's the Rights Revolution, where the rights of historically marginalised groups such as ethnic minorities, women, LGBT people, children and non-human animals are recognised as being important. In Better Angels, Pinker attributed the decline of violence to a number of forces, including protection and security provided by the state, economic interconnectedness making violence irrational, the empowerment of women who are usually less violent than men, and increased empathy, especially for those who are different. However, the force Pinker considers most important is increased rationality leading to better moral values and improved problem solving. In particular, he credits the rise of humanism and liberalism during the Enlightenment with creating a world where human rights and the natural equality of all people are, at least in theory, widely accepted. In such a world, Pinker argues it is difficult to justify visiting violence on others. Of all the criticisms people make of Better Angels, the one I hear most frequently is that it's simply too positive. People who make this argument basically say that the world does not always get better and that disaster could be right around the corner. And to be fair, some of the progress charted in these 2 books has reversed. Last year, the pandemic caused extreme poverty to increase for the first time in 3 decades. Violent crime in the United States is currently on the rise. Even before the pandemic, the world was facing serious challenges. Democracy has been in decline since the mid-2000s, and climate change threatens to make many of the world's problems much worse. However, these objections really misunderstand Pinker's argument. Throughout Better Angels, Pinker emphasises that progress is neither linear nor consistent. It's patchy and can be reversed. Even more importantly, Pinker emphasises that progress was not inevitable in the past and is not inevitable in the future. It takes work, persistence, and the belief that progress is even possible in the first place. And I think this is what makes Better Angels and Enlightenment Now especially relevant today. The first of these lessons, that progress is patchy, should encourage us to look at the long-term trends. While extreme poverty has risen over the past 2 years, the portion of people living in extreme poverty remains lower than it was even when I was born in 1998, by almost 2/3. Though violent crime is rising in the United States, it is still lower than it was at the peak of the 1960s to 1990s crime wave. The current threats to democracy notwithstanding, there are more democracies today than there were for most of the last century, and before the 18th century, there weren't any liberal democracies in the world at all. Now, none of this is to deny the concerning recent developments or to ignore the suffering they cause. It's important that that's acknowledged. However, it is also important that we acknowledge that many of the long-term trajectories remain positive. Obviously, none of this is to say that there are not serious problems in the world. Too many people still live in extreme poverty, and too many people are victims of violence, and too many people live under authoritarian regimes, and too many people don't have their rights respected even in democracies. And of course, for all the advocacy and agreements around climate change, carbon dioxide emissions are still rising. This is where Pinker's argument in Better Angels is important, that progress is not inevitable, but it is possible and achievable. And we know that because progress on all of these fronts has happened. Most importantly, it has been achieved in the past through processes built on liberal values. We live in a day and age when politicians on both the left and the right, but mostly the right, are threatening liberal values and institutions. To get elected, they usually point to problems, say the system isn't working, and that they need to be allowed to basically trash the system to fix the problems. But Better Angels and Enlightenment now show us that problems in the past have been solved, or at least ameliorated, precisely through liberal values and institutions. When we abandon or weaken them, we threaten the progress and make future progress more difficult. 10 years on from the publication of The Better Angels of Our Nature, that remains as important as ever.